Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today's episode 38, Big Brothers and Their Economies, Assad, Duvalier, and Tito, with Mr. Jiho Kim. Mr. Jiho Kim is one of the smartest and most talented individuals that I've met in my life. He's currently a junior at Seoul High School in Seoul, South Korea, and he's very talented when it comes to about the economies of different dictators and different monarchs in the world. And we're very glad to have him here with us today to discuss about these three individuals. Mr. Jiho Kim, thank you so much for coming to our podcast. Is there anything that you would like to add to the introduction?
First, I'm extremely honored to be part of this, and as someone who's interested in politics, I think I can bring a lot to the table for today. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jiho Kim, for that very wonderful introduction. Now let's move on to our topic of discussion for today, episode 38, Big Brothers and Their Economies, Assad, Duvalier, and Tito. So now let's talk about the context of these three individuals and the countries that they rule. Assad ruled Syria, and the Assad regime from Hafiz al-Assad through his son Bashar al-Assad was built on a highly centralized state-directed economic system. And the regime's economic model was intertwined with its security apparatus designed to sustain a security state that kept opposition in check, and public enterprises dominated, and a network of patronage and cronyism helped maintain loyalty among key groups. Over time, however, this approach led to inefficiencies, stagnation, and economy heavily reliant, burdened by debt and corruption. And the recent developments indicate that the legacy of Assad-era socialism is now seen as an impediment to modernizing the economy. New leaders are moving to dismantle and reform the structures in the hopes of attracting foreign investment and reviving growth. As for Duvalier's Haiti, François Duvalier, also known as Papa Dog, and later his son Jean-Claude, Baby Dog Duvalier, ruled Haiti with an iron fist. Their model was less about a coherent ideology and more about using populist rhetoric, repression, and clientelistic networks to remain in power. The economy under the Duvaliers was marked by severe corruption, mismanagement, and extraction of wealth by a narrow elite. And state resources were often funneled to maintain the cult of personality and to reward loyalists and to finance the infamous Tontons Makuts, while widespread poverty and underdevelopment persisted. And Haiti's economy under Duvalier is one of the deepest structural weakness and a chronic state of underinvestment in social and infrastructure development. And now talking about Tito's Yugoslavia. In contrast, Josip Broz Tito's Yugoslavia adopted a distinctive form of socialism, often described as self-management socialism. Tito's regime broke with the rigid Soviet model by decentralizing some of the economic decision making, allowing for worker cooperatives and market elements within a socialist framework. His government managed to balance central control with a measure of economic flexibility and non alignment in foreign policy. This model not only sustains relative political and social stability during Tito's lifetime, but also allowed Yugoslavia to garner economic assistance and trade from both East and West. Although internal inefficiencies and later nationalist tensions eventually contributed to the nation's disintegration, Tito's economic approach is also often cited as example of a more pluralistic, if not unsustainable, socialist system. And now, so these are a very brief introduction about the three economies and the three economies that were run by the three big brothers. Is there anything that you would like to add to the context of these three countries or three economies, or is there anything that you would like to add to the introduction about the three economies in general? Mr. Jiho Kim, and Mr. Shazib Karim, or Mr. Arif Malik? Mr. Arif Malik, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yes, apologies, the mic wasn't.
Yes, Mr. Shazib Karim, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think I was having some technical issues, so I can continue. So I think Arif, you gave like a good introduction of them, but adding on to we could look at Syria's state-controlled economy by Hafiz al-Assad, and he came to power in 1971 and ruled Syria until his death in the year 2000, I believe. And economically, his strategy was clear: a socialist, state controlled economy with a heavy reliance on oil and foreign aid. And under his rule, the government controlled everything, the major industries, agriculture, and even the banking sector. And back then, Syria was backed by the Soviet Union, receiving economic and military aid. And for them, oil became a key revenue source. But instead of diversifying, Assad doubled down on state owned enterprises. And the result of this, you may ask? Well, I think some early economic growth in the 1970s, but there was stagnation by in the 1980s. And there was a lot of corruption. And with the collapse of the USSR in 1991, Syria faced economic decline, debt, and isolation. Whereas we can also shift the focus to Haiti under François Papadoc Duvalier, and he ruled from 1957 to 1971. And if Assad used state control, Duvalier's approach was something else entirely. It was pure economic parasitism. He looted state funds, siphoning aid money into personal accounts, and Haiti's economy relied heavily on agriculture, particularly coffee exports. But he imposed heavy taxes and centralized control, choking off the private sector. And the famous Tonton Marquette Militaire, his private enforcers, made sure that no opposition to his economic plunder existed. And by the time he died in 1971, Haiti was one of the poorest nations in the world, with decaying infrastructure and an economy in free fall. And yet, he was able to maintain US support for years because of the Cold War politics, just proving that sometimes geopolitics props up even the worst economic policies. And finally, we have Josip Broz Tito, the man who defied both the Soviet Union and the West while crafting his own brand of socialism. Tito ruled Yugoslavia from 1945 until his death in 1980, and his economic model was market socialism, a mix of state planning and worker self management. And under Tito, heavy industrialization was pushed, but unlike the Soviets, he allowed some forces to play a role. And the economy boomed in the 1960s and 70s with high GDP growth and a rising standard of living. However, this was fueled by foreign debt, which exploded in the 1980s, leading to economic instability. And after his death, economic mismanagement, debt, and rising nationalist tensions contributed to the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And I think what we can see from these authoritarian economic models is that state control can be a double-edged sword, as Assad's model worked for a while but made Syria vulnerable when global conditions change. And Duvalier's Haiti never had a chance because of his sheer economic mismanagement and greed, whereas for Tito's Yugoslavia thrived on aid and debt, but that house of cards eventually collapsed. So I think that while authoritarian leaders may shape economies through control, fear, or ideology, I think that like just like the statistics and history shows that without flexibility and economic adaptability, their systems tend to crack.
Mr. Arif Malik, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything? My apologies. It was Mr. Jiho Kim. Mr. Jiho Kim, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah. So it seemed like you said a lot about all three of those people, but I think I'm gonna focus on Bashar al-Assad. So Bashar al-Assad's economic policies weren't about growth. They were more about maintaining power. When he took over in the year 2000, he introduced privatization, but instead of fostering a free market, he created a system where only regime loyalists benefited. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of elite families, like his cousin, who controlled major industries while ordinary Syrians faced economic stagnation and rising costs. So this deep inequality fueled discontent among the people, particularly in rural areas and among the working class, who saw fewer opportunities while the regime's inner circle flaunted luxury. The loss of government subsidies and high unemployment only worsened this situation. By 2011, when protests erupted, economic frustration played a major role. Rather than address these grievances, Assad responded with violent repression leading to full-scale civil war. And ultimately, his economic model wasn't just about enriching a few. It was a calculated strategy to secure loyalty and punish dissent. This serves as a perfect case of how economic policies in authoritarian regimes are designed not for development, but more for control.
Mr. Arif Malik, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yes, apologies. The mic wasn't turning on. Been facing some internet difficulties today. So yeah, I would like to talk about specifically Bashar al-Assad, as Jiho was stating Assad's crony capitalism. So I would say Bashar al-Assad's rule in Syria, in my opinion, is a masterclass in crony capitalism, where economic policies were not driven by free market principles, but by political survival. I think his regime carefully blended socialist remnants with selective privatization, ensuring that wealth and power remained concentrated within a loyal elite. And this is how Bashar did it. So Bashar inherited a system that was heavily state controlled under the Baath party. However, by the early 2000s, economic liberalization was introduced, not to create a competitive market, but to favor a small circle of businessmen with ties to the regime. And this transition fueled economic inequality, alienating millions of Syrians, particularly in rural areas. And key figures like Rami Makhlouf, who was Assad's cousin, dominated crucial sectors like telecommunications, banking, and real estate. While Makhlouf and other regime linked elites amassed fortunes, small and medium enterprises struggled, and rural communities suffered from rising poverty and unemployment. And what was the consequence of this, you may ask? And it was clearly discontent among the public, which eventually led to the civil war. So the rural people in Syria were clearly economically neglected, and the dismantling of subsidies and neglect of agricultural regions in Syria, which is part of the Levant, uh, led to mass urban migration, overwhelming cities with jobless, disillusioned youth. And the economic system became a means of co-opting or crushing dissent. If you played by Assad's rules, you got rich. If you opposed, you were shut out or worse. So the economic frustration was a ticking time bomb. And by the time Arab Spring reached Syria, millions were already suffering. When protests erupted, the regime doubled down on oppression, leading to a devastating civil war. But the war economy, in my opinion, was a new form of cronyism. After 2011, Syria's economy became militarized, and there was a lot of war profiteering. Loyalists and militia leaders control smuggling and reconstruction contracts and even humanitarian aid. And the fact that Syria was able to do it for so long was because of Iran and Russia's influence. Assad backers exploited Syria's resources, which were mainly the oil, phosphate, and infrastructure projects, in exchange for military support. And there were also narco state tactics. For example, Syria became a major producer of Captagon, a stimulant traffic across the Middle East, with profits benefiting Assad's inner circle. And if we want to talk about Syria today, I would say let's look at the hollowed out economy of Syria. Syria's economy today is shattered. If I'm being frankly honest, the Assad regime still clings to power, even though they, like Bashar al-Assad, literally fled the country. The regime is still the government, all the bureaucrats, all the policemen, all of them are Assad's people. So Assad indirectly is still clinging on to power, but its model of crony capitalism has turned the country into a failed state. So, as of March 8th, which is the recording of this podcast, Syria is undergoing significant political and economic transitions following the ousting of Bashar al-Assad, which happened, I believe, around December. So, the interim government, which is led by President Ahmed al-Shara, is implementing reforms to transition from Assad's era socialism to a free market economy. And the new administration plans to privatize state-owned enterprises and attract foreign investment to revitalize the economy. And also, the Syrian pound has appreciated on the black market since Assad's ousting, aided by the relaxed trade controls and increased foreign visitors. Additionally, the EU has lifted certain sanctions, allowing investments in Syria's oil, gas, and the electricity sectors, which are aiming to catalyze the business activities and reconstruction efforts. However, despite these reforms, challenges persist. Approximately 17 million people in Syria require humanitarian assistance, and 7 million are internally displaced. So, food insecurity and poverty remain widespread, underscoring the need for continued international support. And so, this is basically the crony capitalism under Assad's regime. And I would say under Duvalier and Tito, as I believe Shazib was talking about, Duvalier was mainly a predatory state capitalism in which foreign aids were basically siphoned into elite networks, extortion via voluntary taxes, and totalitarian control over businesses. And for Tito, I would say it was market socialism, where there were self-managed system, decentralized economy, and foreign borrowing to fund high living standards. But I would say one of the key takeaways is that despite the economic model, for example, Assad's crony capitalism, Duvalier's predatory state capitalism, or Tito's market socialism, the result is apparent in all. The result is that there are crushed opposition. There are the people's protests are essentially crushed as well. So there's a lot of dissent, and there's a lot of and this basically I believe widens the income inequality, as it creates it basically generates wealth in the hands of a few. So each of these leaders build systems that prioritize power over the people, and in the long run, all of the nations suffered for it, either through economic decay, dictatorship, or through war. So would you guys agree with that?
Mr. Shazib Karim, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah. I think adding on to Arib, I think and what Jiho also said about Assad, still on this topic, I think yeah, Arib, what you said, I would agree with that. And I think another thing to add on is like we could talk about the Soviet lifeline that he had utilized, because one of the most important aspects of Assad's economy was its dependence on foreign aid, particularly from the Soviet Union. The USSR provided billions in economic and military aid, and and keeping Syria's economy afloat. And in return, Syria aligned itself politically and military wise with the Eastern Bloc. So it was kind of a symbiotic relationship. And the government's budget heavily relied on oil revenues, but instead of diversifying, Assad funneled resources into defense and state-owned industries, and this meant short-term stability but long-term fragility. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Syria lost its biggest financial backer, and the economy entered a deep crisis. And another like thing important to talk about is like the economic decline, stagnation, and unrest, because by the late 1980s and early 1990s, Syria's economy was in deep trouble. Declining Soviet aid forced the government to cut subsidies and social programs. The oil sector failed to modernize, and revenues became unreliable. And unemployment and inflation surged, fueling frustration among the Syrians. And Assad tried some economic liberalization in the 1990s, but allowing limited private sector growth, but by then the damage was already done. The economy remained highly controlled, inefficient, and unable to absorb the country's growing population. So, so based on this, I have a question to ask you guys. Like Jiho has our special guest. You could answer this. So my question to you is, do you think that Assad's economic model heavily relied on nationalization and state control, or do you think this was a strategic move to strengthen Syria's independence, or was it simply about consolidating power?
I think, in my opinion, it was strictly about consolidating power in Syria, because Assad, at the end of the day, was a dictator, and he needed to control his power in Syria and consolidate it in order to make sure that no one is able to control Syria except him. So I think that was the main reason. And I think it's also very important that we look at the economic policies and the tools of power. For example, the Assad Syria was characterized by heavy state ownership, central planning and pervasive state control over industries, and this ensured that economic resources were directed to maintaining regime stability, but it also stifled innovation and productivity over time. While Duvalier Haiti relied less on a formal state-directed development strategies and more on the extraction of rents through patronage networks, and economic policy was subordinated to the need to control the population and suppress dissent, leading to a distorted allocation of resources and chronic insufficiencies. Moreover, Tito's Yugoslavia implemented a mixed model where state control coexisted with workers' self-management, and the firms in Yugoslavia were often seen as cooperatives, giving them a high degree of autonomy and the responsiveness that was absent in most centralized socialist states. And this centralization helped moderate ethnic and religious regional disparities for a time. And I think that we should also look at the outcomes of the legacies of these three big brothers. For example, Syria's legacy, the Assad model produced a regime that was effective at maintaining order and suppressing opposition for decades, but did so at the cost of economic dynamism, the heavy bureaucracy, inefficiencies, and entrenched corruption ultimately led to an economy that became unsustainable in a globalized, market-driven world. And current moves to dismantle the structures, as reported by Reuters, reflect the deep need for reform in the post-Assad era, and the Haiti's enduring challenges have been prevalent after even after Papa Doc's rule. For example, the economic policies under the Duvaliers left Haiti with a legacy of poverty and institutional weakness, and the concentration of wealth among a small elite and the pervasive corruption have made recovery and inclusive development extremely challenging, contributing to Haiti's reputation as one of the poorest nations in the Western Hemisphere. And we can also see Yugoslavia's mixed record. Tito's innovating system brought a measure of prosperity and relative stability compared with other Eastern European states. However, the system was also vulnerable to the eventual rise of nationalism and regional imbalances. After Tito's death, these fissures contributed to the violent breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. So, what's your opinion on the economics of the Assad, Duvalier, and Tito, and what do you think are the implications of the economic policies on their legacies? Mr. Jiho Kim, Mr. Shazib Karim, or Mr. Arif Malik?
So answering Shazib's initial question, I think Bashar al-Assad's economic model was primarily designed for consolidating power rather than fostering broad economic development. While some of his early economic reforms were framed as liberalization efforts, they were ultimately crafted to maintain his authoritarian grip by rewarding loyalists, suppressing dissent, and controlling key sectors. But focusing on rewarding loyalists, um, after Assad assumed power in the year 2000, he inherited a socialist economic model dominated by state-owned enterprises and government subsidies. However, the state-run economy was inefficient and failed to generate enough revenue, especially as oil production declined and population growth increased economic pressures. In response, Assad launched economic reforms that introduced elements of privatization, but not in a way that encouraged genuine market competition. Instead, his form of privatization was selective, benefiting a small elite that was only loyal to the regime. These individuals were often family members, military officials, or business tycoons with close ties to Assad, and they were given control over lucrative sectors, including the telecommunications sector, the real estate and construction business, and the banking and finance. So this process of crony capitalism ensured that wealth and economic power remained within Assad's inner circle. As said, it was they they were given to his close family members or military officials, and those who benefited from this policies had a vested interest in maintaining his rule, as their wealth and status depended on their proximity to power. So I would like Arif to I would like to hear Arif's answer to Shazib's question now.
Yeah, just to chime in here and to answer Shazib's question, I would say, yeah, definitely, the Assad's crony capitalism is a pinnacle of what can happen if the state or a country decides to implement basically the state capitalism, and on top of that, I would also like to say the Assad's economy in Syria is in ruins right now, surviving only through foreign efforts. But more specifically, if we look at Assad's economic model, it's a hybrid state socialism, selective privatization, and war-driven crony capitalism. And it has evolved over time, shifting from the Ba'athist socialism, which he inherited from his father, Hafez al-Assad, to corrupt neoliberal system favoring regime insiders. And as I've stated before, when the civil war erupted in 2011, the economy transformed again into a war economy, sustained by illicit trade, foreign intervention, and military patronage networks. So pre-war economy, as I've said, was mainly from 2000 to 2011. It was a selective privatization for regime insiders, and the consequences was the rural population, especially in Dara, Idlib, and Deir ez-Zor, felt abandoned, fueling early protests in 2011. And there was a growing corruption, and also it was a fertile ground for uprising, because the crony capitalism led to combination of unemployment, inequality, and political repression set the stage for civil unrest. And the war economy, which is from 2011 to 2024, its survival was through illicit trade and foreign support. So after the 2011 civil war in Syria, the Syrian economy collapsed over 80% of the GDP in just few years. And Assad's regime adapted to the shifting war economy using, as I've said, loyalist militias like the National Defense Forces (NDF) to control of local economies, running checkpoints that tax goods and civilians. And warlords profited from selling stolen goods, oil smuggling, and even kidnapping for ransom. And there was also pro-regime businessmen were granted exclusive rights to build destroyed areas, but only loyalists benefited. And I would say foreign economic lifelines were mainly the reason Syria survived. For example, Russia provided financial aid and took over Syria's oil and phosphate industries. Iran supplied economic assistance in exchange for strategic influence and real estate deals. And China invested in post-war reconstruction, hoping to expand its Belt and Road initiatives. And Syria was essentially a drug empire from then on. As the Captagon production, Syria became the world's largest producer of Captagon and amphetamine smuggled across the Middle East. And Assad's government and key figures in the militia, such as Maher al-Assad, which is Bashar's brother, facilitated this drug production. So I would say an interesting point is that even though crony capitalism can exist in Syria, we have to look at the long term. And even though Assad's regime, if you think about it from his father to Assad, let's say like it's around 50 years, like almost half a century. And even during even in this half a century, like people thought that Assad's government would be untouchable. But it just goes on to show like like crony capitalism cannot be sustained in the long run. More importantly, the people doesn't if the people doesn't like your government, then there's no way that the government can sustain in the long run. And we can see that because Russia was involved with the Ukraine war, so they couldn't support Syria directly. And Iran was having Iran was having a particular tension with Israel during that time. So clearly, Iran and Russia, which are the primary backers of Assad's regime, could not support him, which is when the people took control over Syria. And I would say as for Duvalier and Tito, I mean Tito's Yugoslavia it doesn't exist anymore, as Yugoslavia broke down. But I would say each one of these leaders prioritized power over true economic well-being, as we can see. And and I would say one key point of observation that I've noticed is that through Assad's crony capitalism, Duvalier's kleptocracy and predatory capitalism, and Tito's market socialism, all of these factors led to regime elites who control the majority of the state's resources. And also, one common thing that I've noticed is that the leaders, for example, Assad, Duvalier, and Tito, most of their private wealth was siphoned off of the country. So, from economic terms, if you look at the circular flow model, this is a leakage, because money from your country is being sent to another foreign country. So, from an economic model solely, I would say the leaders themselves are also to blame, because they didn't have enough trust in their own economy to keep their wealth in their country.
Mr. Shazib Karim, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for all of your answers. And I think adding on, we could look at the legacies. Like, we since we're talking about al-Assad, we can talk about how his economic model left a impact on his legacy. So I think Assad's, like as we talked about, Assad's economic model was built on state control, oil dependency, and foreign aid, primarily from the Soviet Union. So these implications on his legacy would be that if you look at like the short-term stability, his strict economic policies provided initial stability, particularly in the 1970s, allowing Syria to modernize and expand its infrastructure. But his reliance on state-controlled economy and Soviet aid meant that when the USSR collapsed in 1991, Syria faced economic stagnation, corruption, and unemployment. And the legacy of economic stagnation was like by the time of his son. Um, like Syria was struggling to adapt to the globalization, and the continued economic struggles contributed to the grievances that fueled the Syrian civil war in the 2011. So I think that al-Assad's legacy is one of economic rigidity and missed opportunities. And while he created a strong authoritarian state, his failure to diversify Syria's economy left future generations to deal with the consequences: economic collapse, social unrest, and eventual war.
Mr. Jiho Kim, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Um, one more way that it can be seen that Assad's economic model was for consolidating power rather than for fostering broad economic development is his weaponization of economic hardship. While his economic policies enriched the elite, as I said before, they exacerbated poverty for millions of ordinary Syrians. Instead of investing in broad economic development, his government cut subsidies and allowed inflation to rise. So in the 2000s, subsidies on food, fuel, and electricity were scaled back, raising the cost of living for the poor and working class. Also, this led to high unemployment and underemployment. Many Syrians, particularly in rural areas, struggled to find jobs. State employment declined, and privatized sectors only benefited regime insiders. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Gio Kim. Thank you, Mr. Shazib Karim, and thank you, Mr. Arif Malik, for sharing your opinions. I think that it's also important to talk about the external policies of the three big brothers and their economies. For example, for Syria, historically, Syria aligned with the Soviet Union and later maintained close ties with Russia. Syria's economic model was also partly insulated by external political and military support. However, this external backing also meant that its economic policies were less responsive to the global market forces in the current era. In the current era, as Syria begins to undertake reforms, the government faces the challenge of overcoming decades of isolation and insufficiency. While Haiti's Duvalier era saw a complicated relation with the United States, initially tolerated and at times supported as a bulwark against leftist movements in the Caribbean, Duvalier's repressive and corrupt economic practices eventually led to Haiti's international isolation, and the lack of external investment and sustained aid has also had negative effects on the Haiti's economic development. And this Tito's non-aligned position allowed Yugoslavia to engage with both Eastern and Western blocs, and this unique stance opened up avenues for trade, aid, and investment from broad spectrum of international partners. And the resulting economic openness helped foster a degree of growth and relative prosperity, even as it laid the groundwork for later political and ethnic conflicts. So, what do you think are the long-term legacies of the three countries' international political policies, and how do you think that international political policies have shaped the economies of the three big brothers and of the countries in general? Mr. Gio Kim, Mr. Shazib Kim, or Mr. Arif Malik? Mr. Arif Malik, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yes, apologies. The mic wasn't turning on. So yeah, I think the question you asked off is a great question. How has international politics shaped Syria, Haiti, and Yugoslavia? And I would say, firstly, it's important to understand allies. If you look at the foreign support who backed them, Bashar al-Assad's major foreign backers were Russia, Iran, and China. And why they received the support? Well, because of geopolitical influence, Middle Eastern power balance, and military and economic interests. Russia clearly had economic interest, and they also needed an ally in the Middle East. Same for Iran. And as for China, China is on its quest for global hegemony, which is why China also backed uh, Syria. And as for François and Jean-Claude Duvalier of Haiti, they were mainly backed by U.S. and France because the U.S. and France shared anti-communism during the Cold War, and Haiti was a strategic Caribbean location. And this is the same for U.S. and other countries. For example, Chile as well. U.S. Backed Chile. Chile's Pinochet, who was a anti-communist leader, even though he did some questionable things. So USA also backed Duvalier because he was anti-communist, and Haiti is a sort of a soft power, or in the Caribbean location. And as for Josip Broz Tito in Yugoslavia, USA and USSR both at different times and supported him because Yugoslavia played both sides in the Cold War, and its strategic location in the Balkan region was extremely important. So I would like to say one of the key takeaways from the Cold War politics specifically is that it's a blessing and a curse. Because if you look at Haiti, it was a U.S. supported dictatorship, and the Duvaliers positioned themselves as anti-communist ally, ensuring billions of aid from the U.S. And the U.S. tolerated their brutality and corruption as long as they opposed leftist movements, which were mainly communist based. And I would say after the Cold War ended, the U.S. The U.S. support was dried up, and Baby Doc was overthrown in 1986. And as for Yugoslavia, Tito's masterful diplomacy is the reason which I believe Tito ruled for so long, because the Tito broke with Stalin in 1948, making Yugoslavia the only socialist state to receive U.S. aid. He founded the non-aligned movement, balancing between East and West to gain maximum benefits. However, after Tito's death, Western loan stopped, economic crisis hit, and the country collapsed. And as for Syria, I would say they also relied on Soviet ally, and they were essentially Russia's puppet, because Syria was a Soviet ally during the Cold War, receiving weapons, economic, and protection. And after USSR collapsed, Assad had to rely more on Iran. And when the Syrian civil war began, Russia intervened in 2015 to prevent regime collapse and expand its Middle Eastern influence. So I would say, so as for how foreign intervention shaped their collapse, I would say uh, Assad, for example, survived due to Russian military support and Iranian economic aid, but Syria became a Russian puppet state. As for the Duvaliers, when the Cold War ended, the U.S. cut funding, leading to economic collapse and Baby Doc's exile in 1986. And for Tito's Yugoslavia, once U.S. and Western loans stopped in the 80s, Yugoslavia's economy collapsed, fueling nationalist conflict and civil war. Now, and as for modern international influences, where are they now? If you think about it, Syria is heavily dependent on Russia militarily, Iran for economically, and China for investments. It's war torn and isolated from the West. As for Haiti, it's still reliant on US and UN humanitarian aid, but ignored it geopolitically after the Cold War, and the economic collapse continues. As for former Yugoslavia, some states, for example, Slovenia and Croatia, have joined the EU and NATO, while others like Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina remain economically weak and politically unstable. So, Arav, as to answer your question and to give my final verdict, who was the most affected by international politics? I would say if you look at Tito's Yugoslavia, it was most dependent on Cold War dynamics. And once the Cold War ended, so did Yugoslavia. As for the Duvaliers' Haiti, they were more directly propped up by the US, and without American support, their regime collapsed. And as for Assad Syria, they are still a key piece in international politics and survives due to Russian and Iranian backing. So, as for final thoughts, I would say these regimes thrive because of foreign support, but once the support was withdrawn, they crumbled. Assad adapted best by shifting from Soviet support to Russian, Iranian, and Chinese backing. I would say Tito played the Cold War diplomacy really well, creating the non-aligned movement. But Yugoslavia couldn't survive in a unipolar world, and the Duvaliers were purely opportunistic, and their country paid the price after their fall. So I would say final verdict. I would say yeah, as I've mentioned, like each one of them have their own scenario, but I would say Assad adapted the best in terms of current international politics. Tito played really well during the Cold War, and as for the Duvaliers, I would say they didn't really benefit from the international politics, other than the fact that they were soft power in the Caribbean, and they were purely opportunistic, greedy leaders, and their country paid the price after the fall. So, would you guys agree with the verdict?
Yeah, Arif, I think that was very well said, and I would totally agree with with the verdict. And I think um, just adding on to what you said, if we look at oh, sorry, my mic got muted. But I think adding on, like for example for Assad, it in their economic models did have like significant implications on their country and long-term consequences as well. Like for example, there were consequences for Syria, like the economic crisis that began in the 1990s exacerbated inequality, and by the time the Arab Spring protests reached Syria in 2011, decades of economic frustration exploded into full-scale war, and a war economy controlled by external forces. Like today, Syria's economy is heavily influenced by Iran, Russia, and the militias, making it more fractured than ever. If you look at the current situation of Syria, Syria is now a failed state with a shattered economy, high inflation, and mass displacement. The rigid, oil-dependent model Assad built collapsed, leaving the country in long-term crisis. And if you look at Haiti, like there were also long-term consequences for Haiti. Like for example, it is still one of the poorest countries in the world. Like the economic damage caused by Duvalier left Haiti permanently underdeveloped, and corruption became institutionalized, leading to recurring political crises, assassinations, and coups. And Haiti still cannot sustain itself economically and relies heavily on international aid for survival. Like for today, Haiti struggles with extreme poverty, gang violence, and political chaos. The institutions that Duvalier destroyed were never rebuilt, making it impossible for Haiti to escape its economic and political crisis. And now, looking at Yugoslavia, like in today's world, in the current situation, the former Yugoslavia is now a collection of independent states, with countries like Slovenia and Croatia integrating into the EU, while others like Bosnia and Kosovo still struggle with economic instability. Tito's model collapsed the moment he died, proving it was built more on his leadership than a sustainable economic system.
Mr. Jiho Kim, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Uh, I would say I agree with most of what you said, but focusing on the lasting impact of foreign influence on these economies, the cases of Syria, Haiti, and Yugoslavia show that the economic survival of dictatorships is rarely a purely domestic affair, and it's usually shaped by international policies, geopolitical interests, and financial support from external actors. Whether through the Cold War calculations, economic aid, or global financial institutions, international forces have played a pivotal role in sustaining these regimes, often prioritizing short-term strategic interests over long-term stability. In the long run, these international policies have left behind deep economic distortions, weak state institutions, and cycles of dependency that continue to affect these nations today. Syria remains trapped in a geopolitical struggle between Russia, Iran, and Western sanctions. Haiti remains heavily reliant on international assistance, yet unable to build sustainable economic structures. The former Yugoslav states continue to navigate the legacies of economic collapse and ethnic division, with some nations thriving while others remain mired in instability. So I think the lesson from these histories is pretty clear. International backing can prolong authoritarian regimes, but it rarely leads to sustainable economic or political stability. When economic policies are crafted for short-term strategic gain rather than long-term, the result is often a fragile state that collapses under its own contradictions, which leaves behind a legacy of poverty, conflict, and instability that lasts for long generations. Is there anything that you would want to add?
I think it's also important to talk about the social consequences and legacies of the three big brothers. For example, in Syria, the state's role in the managing the economy was closely linked with security operations that suppressed civil society and limited genuine social mobilization. And although this maintained order for decades, it also eroded trust and hindered the development of a vibrant middle class. In contrast, Duvalier Haiti saw a legacy of deep social inequality. The extractive nature of its economic policies not only kept the general population impoverished, but also fostered widespread resentment and instability that still plagues Haiti today. And Yugoslavia's approach under Tito promoted a form of social ownership that, in theory, could have built a more inclusive society. However, in practice, the compromises inherent in self management meant that some regions or groups benefited disproportionately, sowing seeds of ethnic and regional discontent. And both Syria and Haiti inherited path dependent structures where economic reforms required dismantling decades old institutions, and Syria's current attempts at privatization face the dual challenges of overcoming entrenched bureaucratic corruption and adopting a system that has been long isolated from global markets. And Haiti, on the other hand, is still battling the structural constraints imposed by a history of clientelism and economic extraction. And Yugoslavia's legacy, though more dynamic during Tito's rule, still provides lessons on the challenges of managing a multi-ethnic economy, especially when economic regional identities become politicized in the absence of a strong central unifying force. So, what do you think were the consequences of the policies of the three big brothers when it comes to social cohesion in the three countries? Mr. Jiho Kim, Mr. Shazib Kim, or Mr. Arif Malik?
Can you repeat the question?
What do you think were the consequences of the economic policies on their policies in general on the social cohesion in the three countries? Mr. Shazib Karim, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah. So if you look at how the economic policies shape the social cohesion, like I think for Assad, it by the time protests erupted in 2011, resentment against Alawite elites had grown. Many Sunni Muslims saw the Assad government as an oppressive sectarian regime, and the Sunni rule poor felt abandoned, leading them to support opposition movements. Meanwhile, Alawites and government loyalists defended the regime, fearing that they would lose power and wealth. And millions of Syrians fled due to the war, further breaking the country's social fabric. And today, Syria remains a divided, war-torn nation with little hope for national unity. And Syria is now fractured along sectarian, ethnic, and economic lines. Assad's economic favoritism and corruption fueled long term resentment, leading to civil war and permanent instability. And if you look at Haiti, like the economic elite remained in power while the majority struggled with poverty and illiteracy. The country never recovered from Duvalier's looting, and each government since has struggled with corruption and weak institutions. And today, much of Haiti is controlled by armed gangs, filling the power vacuum left by weak governance. And Haiti is still deeply divided between the tiny elite and the struggling majority. Corruption, violence, and inequality make social cohesion nearly impossible with deep distrust in the government and no functioning economy to unify the people. And for like, if you look at Yugoslavia, about Tito's policies, like unlike Syria or Haiti, parts of former Yugoslavia have stabilized, but ethnic tensions remain strong, especially in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Serbia. Tito's failure to build a long-term political or economic framework for unity meant that Yugoslavia could not survive without him. So yeah, would you guys like to add anything? Yeah, Jiho, your hand is raised.
Yeah, I'd say in terms of the lasting impacts of foreign influence on authoritarian economies, the cases of Syria, Haiti, and uh,
And Yugoslavia.
yeah, Yugoslavia. So I think for starting with Bashar al-Assad, his economic policies intensified social and regional divisions that had already been brewing under his father's rule. While Syria had long been a diverse nation with multiple religious and ethnic groups, Assad's crony capitalism and selective privatization disproportionately favored certain segments of society, which deepened pre-existing inequalities. One of the starkest divides was between urban elites and rural populations, as was said before. Assad's economic reforms in the early 2000s opened up sectors such as finance, real estate, and retail to private investment, but these opportunities were only accessible to those with close ties to the regime. Wealthy business elites in Damascus and Aleppo, particularly those from Assad's inner circle, benefited a lot, while rural populations and working class citizens saw little to no improvement in their economic conditions. When the government reduced subsidies on essential goods, such as fuel and food, the hardest hit communities were those in the countryside, where resentment against the regime grew rapidly. Additionally, sectarian divisions were reinforced through economic favoritism. The ruling Assad family belongs to the minority Alawite sect, and under both Hafiz and Bashar al-Assad, the business elites gained disproportionate economic advantages. While not all of them were wealthy and not all Sunnis were poor, the perception of economic privilege along sectarian lines fueled tensions, especially between the Sunni majority, many of whom felt politically and economically marginalized. So when protests erupted in 2011, they were driven not only by demands for political reform, but also by decades of economic exclusion and resentment. The government's response to this brutal repression, combined with further economic punishment of opposition areas, turned these divisions into a full-scale civil war. And as said before, today Syria remains deeply fragmented, with different parts of the country under the control of Assad's forces, opposition groups, Kurdish factions, and foreign-backed militias. And for in terms of Haiti, the Duvalier dynasty weaponized economic suffering to maintain control, creating long-term consequences that still shape the country today. The systemic mismanagement of foreign aid, corruption, and economic exclusion under Papadaka not only kept the majority of Haitians impoverished, but also eroded trust in government institutions. One of the most damaging legacies of the Duvaliers was the deliberate destruction of Haiti's middle class. Fran- François Duvalier saw educated professionals, civil servants, and intellectuals as potential threats to his regime. Many of them were either exiled, assassinated, or forced into economic hardship, creating a brain drain that Haiti has never fully recovered from to this day. Meanwhile, those who remained were often pushed into economic dependence on the state or had to navigate an economy dominated by corruption and cronyism. So, do you have anything to add to that?
Mr. Arif Malik, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yes, I would. I'm in agreement with Shahzeb and Gio regarding the social cohesion under Assad, Duvaliers, and Tito. So I would say the social cohesion. We have to first define it. I would say it's the ability of a society to remain unified despite internal differences. And I would say the social cohesion was manipulated by the Assad, Duvaliers, and Tito to maintain power. Each one of them had different strategies to keep control, but their actions ultimately undermined national unity, leading to long-term instability. So as for so if I'm talking primarily about Assad, like he created his version of social cohesion through sectarian favoritism. He empowered Alawite elite, created dependence on the regime for security, and the Duvaliers they created their social cohesion through fear and voodoo mysticism. They used tauntaun makuts to silence opposition and claimed divine legitimacy through voodoo. And Tito created social cohesion through brotherhood and unity doctrine, which suppressed nationalism by balancing ethnic groups and spreading economic benefits. So, if you look at how it backfired, as for Syria, this deepened Sunni Alawite divisions, making civil war more brutal and long lasting. For the Duvaliers, this created a culture of fear, destroyed political discourse, and left Haiti socially fractured after their fall. And as for Yugoslavia, this prevented ethnic conflicts under Tito. But after his death, nationalist tensions exploded into war. And if we look at, for example, the social fragmentation and long-term consequences, for Assad, the social cohesion broke down after the Arab Spring protests in 2011, which exposed economic and sectarian grievances, and civil war, which is still occurring in Syria today. It shattered national unity. For the Duvaliers, their social cohesion broke down after Baby Doc fled in 1986. Haiti had no strong institutions to replace the dictatorship, and political chaos followed. For Yugoslavia, I would say Tito, his strong leadership kept ethnic tension suppressed, especially in the Balkans with the Serbs and the other ethnic groups. But after his death in 1980, those tensions exploded into war, and the effects today can be very clearly seen. For example, Assad's effects created deep ethnic and sectarian divisions, internally displaced millions, and created reliance on warlocks for governance. For Haiti, it has endless instability, gang violence, and weak governance, and Haiti remains a fragile state. For Yugoslavia, the effects today are not that deep. They broke into multiple countries, some thriving. For example, Slovenia and Croatia, as I've mentioned, they're part of EU. But Serbia and Bosnia are primary examples of countries that are still struggling. But I wouldn't say that's primarily due to Tito. And I would like to talk about lastly the modern social cohesion and can these countries rebuild. So I would say for Syria, the social cohesion, uh, in order for it to be restored, it's going to be very difficult because sectarian divisions are deep. Assad's government has fled, but there's still the new government isn't still as stable, and millions of refugees remain abroad. For example, in Turkey. As for Haiti, I believe the social cohesion is unlikely, but unlikely because the corruption and violence prevent the formation of strong institutions. And for Yugoslavia, I would say the social cohesion has been restored in some countries, for example, Slovenia and Croatia, which are thriving in EU. But as I mentioned, especially Serbia and Bosnia, they're still struggling with ethnic tensions. So I would say my final verdict is that for the who managed the social cohesion best, I would say Yugoslavia kept the country during Tito. The social cohesion was there, but after his death, the country uh, the country became unstable. But as of now, I would say it's not that bad. For most destructive, I would say Assad Syria created sectarian divisions, which fueled a catastrophic civil war, and social cohesion in Syria cannot be reached for now. And for Duvalier's Haiti, I would say social cohesion can be reached, but the problem is that they don't have any strong institutions, and the same is for Syria. So I would say in order for social cohesions to rebuild in these countries, they first of all need to get rid of corruption, and more importantly, they need to build strong institutions. And I would say one of the good examples when we look at how countries can build social cohesion is United Arab Emirates. They have the United Arab Emirates. If memory serves me correct, is composed of multiple states. It's a federation of six emirates: Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, Ajman, Al Quwain, and Fujairah. And while the seventh emirate, Ras Al Khaimah, joined the federation in 1972. So I would say UAE is a good example of how, even though there are different sort of ethnicities in UAE, they still build a strong social cohesion, given the fact that the government and the institutions are extremely strong. Corruption isn't prevalent as much. I mean, there is no corruption reported. So UAE is one of the least corrupt countries in the world, which goes on to show that if the institutions are strong, social cohesion can be managed.
Thank you for the very detailed analysis of Mr. Arif Malik. And I think we should also talk about a little bit about the cult of personality that was built on the three leaders. For example, Hafiz al-Assad and later Bashar relied on a heavy centralized military status, where a state where loyalty was maintained through a vast security apparatus, and their regimes built an enduring personality cult that was deeply interwoven with the Ba'athist ideology. And Assad's public speeches combined calls for Arab unity with harsh anti-Israel rhetoric, while also promising a modern, albeit controlled, economic reform. And this mix of ideological messaging and repression created a regime that, despite modernization efforts, was seen as repressive and corrupt over time. And recent accounts describe the Assad family as having built an empire of fear, relying on a blend of economic, military coercion, corruption, and strategic alliance with foreign powers like Iran and Russia. And François Papadox Duvalier fashioned his rule around the mystical and cultural elements of Haitian voodoo, and by presenting himself as a voodoo priest with supernatural powers, he not only instilled fear but also tapped into deep-rooted cultural beliefs to legitimize his authority. And his regime created a cult of personality that merged traditional folklore with brutal state repression. And Duvalier's personal enrichment and use of a state controlled death squad, the Tonton Makud, terrorized opposition and ensured that dissent was silent. And his rule left a legacy of extreme corruption, economic mismanagement, and deep social scars that continue to affect Haiti. And on the other hand, Tito, in contrast, built his legacy on a more collectivist, though no less authoritarian foundation. His leadership style was marked by pragmatic decentralization through self-management socialism, and Tito promoted worker participation and allowed a degree of local autonomy, which helped maintain a fragile but relatively stable multi-ethnic state. And all this regime was still authoritarian, Tito managed to create an image of inclusive governance and national unity that was distinct from the rest of the overt cults of personality seen in Syria and Haiti. And his style of leadership has been widely studied as a unique experiment in socialist self-management that temporarily bridged ethnic divides ethnic rules. And so, what's your opinion on the legacy of the cult style rules of the three leaders or three dictators, Mr. Arif Malik, Mr. Jiho Kim, or Mr. Shazib Curry? Mr. Shazib Curry, my hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sure, Arfan. Like, so I think if you look at the way they ruled, I think as we talked about, Assad ruled Syria with absolute control, using a mix of military power, economic favoritism, and repression. And I think, like, my verdict on Assad's rule is that Assad was a master of survival, but a failure as a nation builder. He maintained power for a while, but at the cost of economic progress and social unity. His refusal to reform meant that um, Syria was too fragile to handle modern economic challenges, leading to the eventual civil war. And I think if you look at Francis Duvalier, which is, um, I would say, in my opinion, was the worst of the three by far, because, like, I see him as like a self-serving tyrant, because he didn't just mismanage Haiti, he actively looted it. Unlike Assad or Tito, who at least built something, Duvalier only destroyed it. His rule left permanent scars on Haiti, making it one of the world's most dysfunctional states. And I think, also looking at um, Tito, Tito was the most effective dictator, but his success was temporary. And his, like, um, Tito was the most successful of the three, ruling Yugoslavia as a benevolent dictator who balanced socialism with market incentives. And I think, giving my verdict on it, I'd personally say that Tito was the best ruler of the three, but his success was short lived. He built a strong country while he was alive, but his failure to create a lasting political or economic structure meant that Yugoslavia fell apart like soon after his death. And his rule was impressive, but ultimately it was unsustainable.
Thank you, Shazia, for the statement. And I think we can conclude our discussion for today. And based on discussion, I think we can conclude that Assad, Duvalier, and Tito were authoritarian leaders who each shaped their country's economic and political systems in distinct ways. And Assad in Syria built a tightly controlled security state that combined selective reforms with harsh repression. Duvalier in Haiti ruled through a cult of mysticism and terror that enriched a small elite. And Tito in Yugoslavia pursued a unique blend of socialist self-management that maintained relatively unity despite deep ethnic divides, and each left a scarring legacy with lasting impacts on the country's future, which is very unfortunate in my opinion. So, is that a conclusion that all of you would agree with?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I would say that's a pretty good conclusion.
I concur.
Yeah, so that brings, thank you for your concurrence, and that brings to the end of our episode for today, episode 38, Big Brothers and the Economics, Asa, Duvalier, and Tito with Mr. Jiho Kim. Mr. Jiho Kim, thank you for very much for joining today's podcast. Is there anything that you would like to say before we depart for today?
I think this session was an extremely good opportunity to learn various things from these three economic authoritarian regimes, and I hope we see each other again soon.
Thank you, Mr. Jiho Kim, for that wonderful conclusion. And that brings us to the end of our podcast for today, episode 38, Big Brothers and the Economics, Assad, Duvalier, and Tito with Mr. Jiho Kim. And thank you to the audience for listening to this podcast. And we really hope that you enjoyed our podcast. And we hope to see you next week with another very interesting topic, with another very interesting guest speaker. Thank you, and goodbye for now.